And so I had it setting in the kitchen window right behind the table where we eat. That's where I sat it. And Colin was little. He was like 5. And Colin and Kate, they had the hardest time getting. They thought it was the funniest thing in the world that Eileen and I were their mom and dad. It was like that, to them, that was the funniest thing on the planet. And so Colin is standing there. We're doing something in the kitchen. He's like right here. He said, "Grandpa," he pointed at the paddle, said, "Did you really used to whack my mom on the bottom with that?" And I said, "Yes, and Colin, indeed I did. I whaled the daylights out of her bottom, and if you're not good, I'll whale the daylights out of your bottom too." So you got it where it's supposed to be. You can't let an evil deed go unpunished, because all it does is beget another evil deed, no matter where it is. You know, the military has this down pretty pat. You know, they realize you can't let bad behavior go undone. So, at any rate, this is the passage I quote most in Ecclesiastes. I just think our whole world has gone the other whole way with it. So let's back up from that. That's 8:11 here on the second page. Let's back up to 7:29 and 7:20. And let's go ourselves backwards.
7:20 and 7:11.
Yeah, and 29. So we just have to back up from chapter 8 here. So let's look at verse 20. "Indeed, there is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and who never sins." Okay? This is interesting. Up in our sobering thought, that we must all come to grips with being sinners and sinning. Let's never fall into some delusional mind game that we're all good people. No, we are not. Probably every day I say to God, "God, I am a miserable, wretched sinner. I know that. In fact, sometimes it astonishes me, the evil that runs through my heart." And so let's go down to 29. "Behold, I have found only this, that God made men upright," meaning God made people good, Adam and Eve, "but they have sought out many devices," meaning many kinds of sin. And so here's our sobering thought. God made men righteous, but they sought out many sins. Sobering thought. Now this is really sobering. Left to ourselves, we will all look for sin to do. If we don't have constant righteousness working in our lives, as human beings, we'll just keep sliding off into sin more and more and more. That's why it's a dangerous thing when people stop going to church. I mean, someday I'm going to sit down and count all the people that have gone through our church in the time I've been here.
Yes.
But I have enough of them in the back of my brain that I can tell you, of the dozens and dozens, perhaps hundreds if I counted them all up, there's only 1 or 2 that went on in their spiritual life. Their spiritual life went backwards. And most of them never got it reclaimed. And so the point being, left to ourselves without God's supernatural interference in our lives with spiritual stuff and the church and the body of believers that helps, all the good things that God puts in to keep our spiritual life going, left to ourselves, we will find sin to do. We will just keep sliding off into more sin and more sin and more sin. That's why it's a fallacy when those people say, "Well, I have to come to church. I can worship God on the golf course." Oh, yeah, sure you can on Sunday morning while church is going on. That's God's really honored with that. So, anyway, that's what those 2 passages mean, which are very sobering. Ecclesiastes 7:20 and 7:29. There's no person, in fact, the key passage on sin, Romans, where there's none righteous, no, not one. The text there in the Greek language is that we are continually sinners all the time. We are continually doing sin. It's not like we do a sin because we're good and that's an anomaly. It's that we are consistently, continually doing sin all the time. And so left to ourselves, we'll become bigger sinners without God's influence in our lives. That's those two very sobering passages. So I want to stop there for a second before we look at a couple more here that I want to make sure we get. So any thoughts there about, which again, by the way, the whole business of being sinners flies in the face of half the theology that's out there, even in the reasonably good Bible-believing realm. The whole theology of Arminianism, which contrasts, as we put people's names to it, which I don't like doing, the theology of Calvinism, says that in our salvation, we cooperate with God for our salvation. And when we do good stuff, we're cooperating with God. It's not as though God does it through us. It's a whole wrong system of theology of how sin works. So, at any rate, the real truth of the Bible flies in the face most of the time with current non-biblical human opinion, and sometimes with biblical human opinion, because people haven't really studied it out and looked at it clearly. So let's stop there for a second. I'll stop talking. Guys, give me a thought or two.
I was brushing my teeth this morning, and this awful thought went through my head, and I thought, God,
where did that come from?
I've been a Christian all these years. Who's back there speaking this Tommy rot in my mind?
Oh, you are. Okay, let's clarify this.
Yes.
Okay.
It just doesn't seem like it's me.
It is. It is. I can guarantee you that it is. Okay, remember that Satan does not have access to our minds. There's no place in Scripture that gives us, and the only one passage that even says anything like that is oh gosh, I'm having a senior moment here.
Okay.
Judas. The text says that Satan put it in the heart of Judas. Now remember, the heart is emotions, always. It's not intellect. The mind is intellect. That's consistent throughout all the New Testament, throughout all the Bible. So there's a big difference between mind and heart, intellect and emotions. So that's the only passage we have that gives us direct thing. And remember, Satan is, he's not omni-anything. He's not omniscient, he's not omnipresent, he's not omni-anything. He can only be one place in God's universe at a time. Now, he does have lots of helpers and all the fallen demons. And so they can prompt us. But the Bible says we have three enemies: the world, the flesh, and the devil. That's it. That's the only three spiritual enemies we have. The world, which has a system of belief that it infects us with. The flesh, which is ourselves, which is fallen. We are our own worst enemy. How many of you remember the comic strip? It was years ago. It was, what was that comic strip called? Pogo. How many remember the comic strip Pogo? You remember there's one comic strip in there where he's standing there and he's saying to someone else, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Yeah, so we are our own worst enemy in sin. So there's the world, the flesh, and the devil. Those three. There's no others. That's it. So we have to decide where our sinful thought comes from. It comes from our sinful flesh. Satan didn't put that in there. He doesn't have time to run around and put stuff in all of our brains. He can't get in our brains anyway. He can get in our emotions really well. So he can, and all those demons can stimulate us by lots of stuff that happens in the world, and by stuff we read and stuff we watch and all kinds of stuff that lodges in our brain that can lodge in there somewhere along with our own sin. If someone of you does not have a bad thought every day, please let me know. The classic story of this is Spurgeon. Spurgeon was preaching somewhere, and he said pretty much this very thing. And he was preaching on Ephesians 6 and the armor of God, how we put on the armor of God to resist the outward snares of the devil and the fiery darts of the devil. And after the message, this man came up to Spurgeon, and this is in one of his books. It's a true story. And he said to Spurgeon, he said, I've got on the full armor of God, and Satan can't get at me, and in opposition to your message, which Spurgeon's message was pretty much on this, you're your own worst enemy, and the sin that indwells you is worse than the outside sin. And so he said, I have on the full armor of God, and I have not sinned. I am not a sinner, and I have not sinned in a long time. Spurgeon weighed well over 300 pounds. Big man. So if he's standing there facing this guy, he just stomps on his foot with all his weight. Whereupon the guy spewed out some obscenities and got mad and angry at Spurgeon, and Spurgeon just sat there and said, ruined your record, didn't you? Thought you weren't a sinner. Thought you didn't know any of that language. Don't try. You can try to fool me, but don't try to fool God. He knows better. Anyway, we have to be careful of this kind of stuff. We have to be honest with ourselves. Every day I tell myself what a wretched sinner I am.
My neighbors will tell you.
Your neighbors will tell you.
I'll tell you what, I confess to my neighbors, every one of them. I said, Red, I am sorry. I said, man, I worked so hard, and these apartments are killing me. I'm going to kill that deer.
I'd like
Somebody
to tell
shoot
you
it.
about swift punishment. When I was a little girl, and this is before I even went to school, so I was like 4 or 5 years, maybe six at that time. But anyway, I lived with my granddad and grandma in West Virginia. And when I did something bad, which I tried to behave, because my granddad would come home out of the fields, and Mom would tell him, my grandma would tell him something, and he'd say, Ronnie, go out and get me a switch. I had to go break off the switch, bring it to my granddad, and he used it. And I didn't do that again. It is swift, and I did not want that again. It teaches you.
Yeah, so punishment.
Quick punishment is like, no.
Oh, yeah. I haven't told you guys my peach tree story. Uh-oh. Yeah. There's a reason, I believe, like Rhonda, I went to live with my grandparents because my father was an alcoholic. And there's a big story there, but my mom and my dad and I lived in this old house in West Virginia after my dad came back from the Second World War. And I was just a little kid because I went to live with my grandparents when I was 5. But the kitchen was like an addition on the house right here, and it had a door out to the backyard. And every time I was bad, there's a peach tree right out there in the backyard. Every time I was bad, my mom would send me out the back door with the butcher knife to cut a limb off that peach tree with which she would whale the daylights out of me. There came a point when there was no peach tree left. Oh, seriously? Oh, yeah. It had no limbs left.
You kept the wrong ones.
No, well, I cut whatever limb was there. And so for some of us, Rhonda, it takes real swift and harsh punishment
We don't want to do it again.
to get to the point of the whole thing. Nancy?
Well, as a kid, I was always the perfect child. But I can remember doing things that I was never punished for because nobody would have thought.
Did you get it?
Because I was, Nancy was the...
It's still that way.
I remember those things. I remember a lot of them.
Solomon talks about that in here, about wicked people that never get caught because people think they're good. He hits on that 2 or 3 times in here.
Oh, jeez.
But
when you're talking about switches, how many times did you have to go back to get a bigger one?
well, yeah, I think
Big enough. Fit the small one.
yeah. After a while, there were no. Yeah.
Nada has a...
Nada.
My boss used to say, no good deed goes unpunished. Unpunished. And I thought, now there's something wrong with that. No good deed goes and unpunished means somebody's punished you. Now that doesn't make